Hello and welcome to the Bucket Lister podcast. Join your host Keith Crockford along with special guests who have travelled the world, here to share stories of their adventures and plenty of inspo to add to your bucket list. Now, let's get into today's episode.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of the Bucket Lister podcast. I'm Keith, your host, and I am back today chatting to Dennis Woods. Now, Dennis is a super interesting character, and he was on our Island Peak trek last season, so last autumn, with Gareth, one of our guides. He was there with his son, Richard, and today we are not going to talk about that trip because I actually want to bring Richard back on to the show at some point to talk about Island Peak and his and Dennis's trip on that one. But today, Dennis has got a super interesting story for us that I want to go into in more detail. So good morning, Dennis.
Morning, Keith. Thanks for inviting me on to your podcast. I've listened to many episodes, and they're great fun to listen to.
Well, thank you ever so much for coming on. Now, when Gareth came back, I mean, I chatted to you a couple of times when you were in Nepal for various reasons. But when Gareth came back, he said to me, you've really got to get Dennis onto the podcast because he has so many interesting stories. And for me, you are one of the only people that I have met in person that has been to both the North Pole and the South Pole. And I find it such a fascinating story that I wanted to get you on today to find out how those two opportunities came about and just go into into more detail, really. So, I mean, you are 69 now.
Yeah.
So were you 69 when you went to try and do Island Peak, or were you 68 at that point?
No, I was 69. Yeah.
69.
I'll be 70 in May. So we did Island Peak last October. Yeah.
And so how old were you then when you decided that the North Pole was going to be on your bucket list?
It was in 2008. So I've got to do the maths, but I was in my sort of 50s, really. And I about 55, I think, if you do the maths right. And the reason I'm a bit vague about it is because it was at a big function we were at, and a pal of mine came over to me and said, I want to go to the North Pole, having he just retired and sold his business. And I want to go to the North Pole. Would you like to join me? And having drunk too much red wine that night, I immediately said, yep, of course I will. And it all started from there. And we started planning the trip within days of that event, once we'd sobered up a bit.
So what goes into, and obviously, you know, you are going to trek, or you skied to the North Pole, but what goes into that? You know, it's not just, you can't just go and book up a holiday and go and say, I want to go to the North Pole. Like, what was the process in that?
Well, we did a bit of research, and we came up with a couple of guides, a guy called Rick Schweitzer and Annie Aggins, who are very experienced polar explorers. And they were taking a group there the following year. But you couldn't just go and join that group and go. You had to go and do training and be tested. I mean, at the end of your training, it's almost like a selection test. And they tell you whether they feel you're up to it and whether you're capable of doing it. And this was done in Minnesota. And the reason we had to go and fly out to Minnesota was because we were taking dogs and dog sledges with us. And so we had to learn to be mushers, learn to mush the dogs and look after them and train with the dogs. We also had to learn how to walk on frozen ice. So we were out in Minnesota going and trekking across the frozen lakes. And on one occasion, they cut a hole in the ice with a chainsaw, and we had to ski across and go into the ice. Well, I don't think we actually used our skis to go in because they lost to the bottom of the water, but we had to go in, but with our ski poles in our hands, and learn how to pull yourself back out of the water. Bearing in mind, when you're going to the North Pole, you're not walking on land, you're walking on frozen sea ice, anything between 3 and 6 feet deep or thick. And below that is probably 14,000 feet of icy water. before you get to the Earth's bed or the sea bed. So it's so you've got to learn how to get out. It's a long way down to the bottom. You can't swim around under the ice for long. So we did all that, and then we had our little test one night when we after we'd finished, where we all had to go into a room and go through what we were good at and what we were bad at, and what we needed to improve on. But Alan and I both got the okay, and we were on a trip, and we were scheduled to go, and we went in the I think it was the March of 2008. It was definitely 2008 in its early season. You go in there in the Arctic's summer period, so when you've got 24 hours of sunshine up there. And that's when we
and where you went in from Norway up to Svalbard?
Yeah, we flew into Oslo, changed planes up to and then flew up to Longyearbyen, which is right up in Svalbard, and sort of the most northern city almost that's got a university. And there's a university there. There's a huge, great coal mining industry used to be there, which is closed down now. And they've got the world seed bank in one of the old coal mines. They've taken seeds from all over the world and buried them in this coal mine there to keep them frozen in case a country has a drought or some sort of devastation, and they can bring the seeds out that are a natural part of the world and regrow their crops. So that's based there now as well. And lots of expedition teams work from there as well. I've been up there separately with my wife and one of the guides that I've become very friendly with, and we've gone out looking for polar bears on Svalbard with snowmobiles and what have you. It's been great fun. It's a great part of the world to go to.
So when we had our chat before the podcast, you had made the decision that you didn't want to sled in, you wanted to ski all the way in. What made you make that decision?
Well, I suppose I've always looked at challenges, and I just felt, taking a ride on the back of a sledge wasn't what I wanted to do. And also, Alan, my pal, was a real doggy person. He loves his dogs, and he really wanted to look after the dog teams and be there. So we split quite nicely between he'd work on the sledge with the musher, a professional musher who owned the dogs and the sledges, and I'd ski out front with the one of the guides. And in fact, it was Annie Aggins, who I mentioned earlier, who was with us, and we were out front looking to find ways for the sledges to get across the ice. And so I just looked at it as a challenge. I wanted to just keep going and physically do the work rather than just sit there and take a ride on the sledge. But having said that, I mean, Alan would say it's blooming hard work on the sledge because you're jumping on and off all the time. You're having to physically pull the thing around.
Yeah, it's not flat, is it? It's not.
Oh, not at all. No, I mean, as I said earlier, you're on absolutely frozen sea ice. So so it's moving all the time, and it's moving away from the pole most of the time. So many mornings when we're waking up in our tents, we could be 2 miles away, further away from the pole than we were the following morning. So you can see you're sliding away. So you've got to make up that ground. And then you're walking on a treadmill through the day to get there. And so all that ice moving around is opening up and forming open leads, they call it. So you've got open water where you can go through and go down into the sea. Or alternatively, it's pushing together and it's making pressure ridges, which can be, as high as a 2-3 story house. And you've got to find your way to go through those pressure ridges. And you can't just take the dogs along the side of a pressure ridge and then do a 90-degree left or right to go through. You've got to leave them set right out on the ice, and you've got to go and find an area, make sure it's safe to get the dogs through. Then we signal with our ski poles, and the dogs would then take a big wide loop, and you'd bring them through in a straight line. There's 7 or 8 dogs in a row on the back of a 1,000-pound sledge, or in the front of a 1,000-pound sledge is it's quite a lot of weight and it's quite difficult. And of course, when you're going over an open lead, you've got to make sure that there is enough ice there. And sometimes we were actually cutting ice with ice picks and putting it into the lead and making it freeze and making sure we had enough weight. And then you'd send the dogs over, and very often you'd get Alan and the musher, a guy called Tommy, to jump off the back. So in case the sledge went through the ice, the humans were safe, because I mean, £1,000 sledge going through the ice, and was going to drag all the dogs with it and anything on board, and all your kit as well, of course. So,
what sort of temperatures were you dealing with when you were up in the North Pole then?
Well, pretty much the same on both polar trips, really. We hit sort of minus 35s, but it's the wind chill that's the real killer, really. That you've got to make sure every inch of your skin and body is covered most of the time, unless it's not particularly windy, and it is. The first sign of any sort of frostbite is it's not good. So you've got to cover up. And so one of the jobs you've got, and one of the things we were being trained on, is to be looking at each other to see if a person's face coverings or hand coverings or whatever are not not able to be seen. And we did have one guy got some frostbite, and he missed the signs. And it's terrible, really, because he was a black guy, and his fingers were going black, and he didn't notice it straight away. Nobody noticed it, and then of course he suddenly realised he was getting pain there, and people looked more closely and realised he'd got a problem. So actually, they brought in a helicopter and flew him out. This was on the second part of the trip. We did 2 degrees, so we did the first degree at 60. It's about 60. Miles is 1 degree on the degrees going north. So we did the first 60 miles, and then a helicopter came in and brought a second team in, and we had a second team of dogs, and so we double the numbers going on the second degree. So 1 degree to the pole we were doing 2, and it so lucky enough there were helicopters based back at a Russian base. It's called Barnio, and the Russians build this base, or they used to. Obviously, with COVID and now with what's going on, it's all changed. But they would drop paratroopers in at the beginning of the season, who would clear some space on the frozen ice. They then drop some small equipment in to start forming a runway, and eventually bigger equipment. Then the aircraft would land with more equipment. Eventually, you've got this huge, great runway built on 2 meters of ice, and then they would land Aleutian jets on there. And we went in with an Aleutian jet originally, landing on this, ice runway to start from the base camp, with all the kit piled up in the back, all the dogs in there, the sledges, and the people. It was quite an amazing trip, really, in that sense. And
in terms of a true expedition, you can't get any more true expedition than that, really, can you? Like, just going in with all your kit, everything's there. Like, the atmosphere there amongst the team must have been, when you landed that first time, that the atmosphere must have been amazing.
It was. I mean, it was sort of slightly normal to start with, because they've got all these tents on the ice, and it's, they have universities from different parts of the world have got tents set up there as well. The Russians were renting out space there. I mean, they spent a lot of money doing it, and they were renting out space there to anybody who wanted to do research, which was great. It was really quite an interesting place to be, and they would feed you very well as well. The one secret about traveling in polar regions, you keep the calories going, and you keep feeding yourself all the time. So they would make sure they were feeding you up well before you left, and then once you got going, I have to say that was the moment. In fact, probably on both my trips, the moment was once you were there on the ice on your own. And I remember the North Pole; it was so cold. I mean, I just remember this wind hitting me as we set off, and I thought, God, I'm going to be out here for the best part of over 2 weeks. Am I going to be able to cope with this? It's so cold. But you just learn to work at it and keep going, and learn different ways to keep yourself warm, really. So
so you knew you had 120 miles to cover. How long did that actually take you? So how long was it supposed to take you, and how long did it take you in the end?
It's about 15 days it was supposed to take. It took us 17. One of the problems was we had a dog ran off, actually, and our musher just went off on his skis looking for him, which wasn't a safe thing to do, because don't forget, in the Arctic, we're also dealing with polar bears. We haven't, even thought about that, but there was training for that. I mean, I was carrying a sidearm. We had a rifle on the sledge, and this guy just shot off with his rifle over his back. And they're natural; they live up there anyway. Live alongside polar bears, and it took a whole day for him to find this dog that had been spooked by one of the helicopters, and just run off. And so it did take a little bit longer. And then we had just a couple of delays trying to get around some open leads. As you know, the polar ice cap is melting. And even in 2008, we were losing a lot of ice up there. And sadly, I think my eldest grandchild is 8, and I'm not even sure that he could actually do the trip that I did when he's when he gets to his 50s, because or 40s, because I think the ice is diminishing so much, it's quite getting less stable up there now.
And I mean, it's on my bucket list at some point to do. And it, like you just said, then, like, I do feel like if I'm going to do it, I need to probably push it lower down or higher up my bucket list in terms of priority because of that. But the one thing that I'm curious of, and I don't know how you felt when you got there, but like when you climb a mountain and you're stood on the top and there's a summit there, like you feel you feel great about getting to the top. You've reached the top. There is a point there. How did you feel when you got to the North Pole in terms of, was it just the same as everywhere else you've been? Is there anything there that made you go, wow, this is amazing? Or was it just like, we've reached that physical spot now?
Well, obviously, there's the sense of achievement. Wow, we've got there. This is what we've been aiming for. This is what we've been training for. This is, so you obviously get that sense of achievement, the same as you would if you were, going over the finish line on a marathon or a triathlon or whatever you're doing, or climbing a mountain, as you say. But it's quite an interesting experience when you get to the North Pole, because remember I was saying earlier about the ice is moving all the time, and therefore you get your GPS and you get there and it goes 0, 0, 0, or 90, whatever, and you stand there and it moves, and within,
you've got to keep stepping sideways all the time.
Yeah, within seconds you're off it, and within second, and you've got to keep moving over, and you've got to keep finding it again. So you don't just go there once, you go there quite a few times, by keep stepping around and getting on that point. And of course, there's nothing there. It's frozen ice. It's ice all around you. It's no different to what you've been on for the last 2 weeks. And so we had to take so there was a rolled up North Pole sign with an arrow in it, and it said North Pole. And we used to hold that up, and I do talks for the Scouts and the Cubs and what have you. Actually, they're fine. They understand it. It's the adults who ask the question about, well, is that always there, that sign? Which it's not. I mean, the ice that you're standing on there, then within 2 years will have reached the outside of the ice pack and will have melted into the sea. And so it's quite surreal. And we had to wait. Well, that was another reason why we were up there for so long. We had to wait another 36 hours for the helicopters to come in, because we had a weather hold. And by the time the helicopters got to us, we were 2-3 miles away from the pole by then, and we moved down. We just slid away in our tents, and so it was quite good. We had a bit of celebration. Annie suddenly got out of her tent, running around with a big banana suit on. She never quite fully explained why she did that. I could never quite work that one out, but anyway, she did. And we some people did some ice sculptures and what have you, and we obviously cooked up loads of rations. The interesting part then was, of course, going back to the base camp. So our musher, Tommy, who'd been excellent all the way through, suddenly eyes lit up when the vodka came out. And so we started drinking some vodka and what have you, and toast with vodka. And when the helicopter arrived, pile all our kit in the back, we get in, there's this huge, great Russian helicopter, these sort of things. They call them the Wasps. They look like wasps, and they sound like wasps when they're in the distance. And we all piled on, and then suddenly realised Tommy's up the front with the cockpit with the pilot and co-pilot, and they're knocking back the vodka. And the pilots are flying us back, just necking vodka out of the bottles. And we had like a 2.5 hour flight, and this thing was, I guess they're just used to it and immune to it, because I think they went through 2 bottles of vodka up the front, between leaving the North Pole and getting back to base camp. I think we thought that was probably the most dangerous part of the whole event, even though we took a run across polar bear tracks and God knows what else. I think the Russians drinking vodka while they were flying us was probably the most dangerous part of the whole trip.
And so you finished that one, ticked that one off. Like, when you decided that you were going to go to the North Pole, was the South Pole ever on your agenda at that point?
No, to be frank, and I hadn't really thought too hard about it. It was just an adventure. We were going to do it. But in doing my research or reading up about going to the North Pole, I got sidetracked more and more and more into reading the stories of the South Pole in the books of Shackleton and Scott and Amundsen and what have you, and found that fascinating, just living in those environments. And the following year, we had a great opportunity, my wife and I. My cousin got a secondment to work down in the Falkland Islands for 3 years. Sent out a bit of a jokey email to the family, to everybody, saying, "Oh, got a big house down here if anybody fancies coming down." And we just said, "We're on our way." And we booked to go down, and we spent 10 days on the Falklands with them, went all around trekking, and beautiful part of the world. If anybody can get to the Falklands, it's just the most stunning place to go and do treks and walks. And I really want to go back there again one day. And then we joined a ship in Stanley Harbour and went down to South Georgia, where I luckily was able to stand at the grave of Shackleton and toast the boss, which is one of the things you do. You toast the boss with a whiskey or a spirit of some sort, because that's what they used to call him, the boss. And he, out of all my readings and of all these things, he's the greatest British explorer we've ever had, I think. I mean, he surpasses everybody else in, and he's not somebody who's actually achieved his goal in the end. But what he did is he brought all his men back alive. He was an amazing leader, and he made decisions that meant he probably didn't make it to the South Pole, but everybody survived. And I got a lot of time for Shackleton, and so I was really proud to stand there. And we went from there down to the peninsula on the ship, and then we were going ashore in Zodiacs and seeing all the wildlife, which is fascinating on the South Georgia and on the Antarctic Peninsula. And it's the only time, because you realise then as you're stepping ashore, and it wasn't until an American who was on this boat with us said, "Oh, it's my 7th continent." And Sue and I sort of counted on it and said, "Oh, crikey, yeah, it is. It's our 7th continent. So if you want to stand on all 7 continents in the world, you've got to go to Antarctica." Yeah. And so we realised we'd just achieved something without actually planning to or even thinking about it too hard. And so, because I'd got into this, and I just thought it was beautiful. I mean, I loved the Arctic, and the Antarctic was looking just as exciting. So, the following a couple of 3 years later was 2011-12, which was the 100th anniversary of Scott and Amundsen both making it to the South Pole. And so I then decided that I'd sign up to go on a South Pole trek. And you couldn't go from the Ross Ice Shelf, which is the way they went, because all the teams that were down there doing that, they'd been booked up for years. So we went to just off the peninsula to a place called Hercules Inlet, and we decided we would go from there. So we set that up, 740-mile trek. You know, can't have dogs down there. You can't have dogs in Antarctica. So you had to be man hauling anyway. So you're pulling your sledges with your tents and your fuel and what have you. And so I booked to do that. And I went down in late October in 2011, flew down to Punta Arenas in Chile, where we were meeting the team, or where I was meeting the team. And Sue, my wife, is quite an adventurer. I mean, we met skydiving, the two of us, so she's always been up for all this sort of stuff. She came down with me to Punta, and then we went off to the Torreston Plain National Park and did some treks up there. And I was listening to one of your podcasts the other day about going to see the glacier carving into the lake, and we
came back there for. Dave was over there with a group last month, so yeah, they had a great time out there, which was the first time we've done a trek down to there, which everyone came back just saying how absolutely stunning it was down there.
It's the most beautiful place. We did treks every day, and the scenery was just totally different. But the one thing I've got, and I do a few talks for Cubs and Scouts and schools and things, and I've got a picture of that glacier, and it shows the side of a glacier with all the crevasses going down, and then the ice on the top, and where it's breaking up. And I point out that's what we were now contending with going across the Antarctic continent, because it's 2 miles of ice from before you get down to it. You're going across land, but there's 2 miles of ice between it. And the only way I can describe it is if you go to the Alps skiing and you see a range of mountains one side and the other side, and you ski into the valley's not there. It's just full of ice, and the tops of the mountains are little nanutucks, they call them, just sticking above, and underneath your feet are all these crevasses that you've got to be aware of crevasse fields and avoid them and navigate them if you have to. So it's a great way of describing it because you can see it side on. I mean, it's nowhere near deep, obviously, when it's got to that point, but it's so it's a great place to go. So we did that, and then we went back to Punta Arenas, where Sue met the team, and we hung around there waiting to fly to the South Pole. And she then she flew back to London, and literally that afternoon we'd had a couple of days of weather holds. Suddenly the weather's great. We've got a window, and it was all rush, and another Aleutian jet, and 4-hour flight from Punta down to Union Glacier, where most of the teams start down there. Company called ALE, Antarctic Logistics and Expeditions Company. They're based. They do it for you. Flew in this huge, great jet again, cavernous inside, all with sides with plywood, so you couldn't see out, and just see a couple of little windows high up above your head, full of kit and a few seats. 4-hour flight, and it lands on a bare ice runway. So basically, a glacier that's had all the snow blown off it, and it's blue ice. And this jet lands on it, going towards these mountains, and puts reverse thrust on and stops you before you, and you all pile out the back. And then you've got these little tractor vehicles that you get in the back of, and they take you another sort of 4 or 5 miles across the ice to Union Glacier Base Camp, which is set up every year by ALE. Huge numbers of tents, and they are supporting teams going on expeditions, teams going down there to do scientific research. And when we were there, was a huge amount of kit they'd flown in for when they were drilling into that Antarctic lake. I don't know if you remember, they were drilling through the ice to get down to the lake to see what they could find. So that was a base for that. And again, fantastic facilities there, medical facilities, all in tents, but all really warm. And but you weren't allowed to sleep in their tents. You had to pitch your own tents, and then we'd go out with our sledges and do all our testing and what have you. And what was quite interesting is the training for this trip. I've been pulling a rubber tire across Chobham Common, which is quite sandy, and I've been putting extra weights in it and making it heavier and heavier. And like me, the rest of the team that were down there were all doing the same. And it was that moment at Union Glacier where we went out for a test trek and set up our tents there to make sure it was all right before we left our support area. And I know each one of us, as we took our first few steps pulling our sledges, have we been putting enough weight? And we were quite relieved to realise that actually it's not as bad as we thought it was going to be to start with. I mean, a month later, it was getting bloody hard work, excuse the phrase, but it was getting harder, And so we stayed there again, waiting for weather holds, and then suddenly, some quite famous explorers there as well. So people going off and doing different treks, and you bump into these people and stand there washing up in the kitchen tent with them, and so on and so forth. And anyway, we got the call, another rush job. All our kit was ready to go into a Twin Otter, and we flew to Hercules Inlet. And the first thing that happened is we couldn't land on the side of Hercules Inlet for various reasons, I think a bit of fog or whatever. So we went the other side, and the inlet was completely iced up. I mean, it's a massive ice shelf there, thick ice all the way across. So that added probably, if we went around the coast, we'd add another 2 days to our trek. But a few of us had already done the North Pole anyway, or been up in the Arctic. And so we voted to just go straight across the ice. And so we set off across the ice. But the interesting thing was there, and it goes back to what you were asking earlier, is what's your first feeling? And the aircraft takes off and disappears in the distance, and disappears from sight and sound. And you look all around you, 360 degrees, and it's nothing but white. There is nothing but snow or ice all around you. It is just empty. And you think, my goodness, what am I doing here? You're there in the middle of nowhere, and it's now, people used to say to me, what do you think of day after day after day when you're pulling that sledge for hour after hour? We do 12, 13 hours a day sometimes pulling sledges. And I said, it's survival. every second of the time you're just thinking about survival, what you're going to do, how you're going to cope with this, staying in touch with all the other people in case we get a whiteout. Got crevasses, of course, well, making sure we get around those. So it's fascinating. And so off we went. And we saw a few mountains. As I said, we only saw the tops of them, the tips of them, not big mountains. They are big mountains, but as we were climbing up from the coast, they started to appear. And we started going along the side of a transantarctic mountain range eventually, which is a continuation of the Andes. The Andes goes down between Argentina and Chile, underneath the Antarctic Ocean, comes up in Antarctica and goes right across Antarctica. So that's one of the reasons. It's not a good reason, but it's one of the reasons Argentina claim Antarctica for themselves. They say it's part of their landmass because the Andes carry on down there. Well, we know that they aren't going to get away with that one, but that's part of their reasoning. But it's stunning, Keith. It's absolutely stunning. Christmas Day, I woke up Christmas morning, and we had a day where we had no wind at all, blue skies. They had the transantarctic mountains, out there, and you just almost thought any second now Santa was going to fly by with his sleigh and reindeer and what have you.
So, did they let you have Christmas Day off?
No, I mean we actually did our longest trek of the whole trip on Christmas Day, our longest stint of the whole trek. It wasn't really a case of whether they would let us have the time off or not. We were a team. We were making joint decisions, and we worked together with it with the advice of both Oscar and Lisa Strong. Lisa was one of our, a brother and sister team, and they're just great people, really experienced in this. So they would guide us, but we make a decision as a team, and we knew we were about 25, 30 kilometers away from our next resupply dump. We had 4 resupply dumps laid out for us. The way Scott and Armandson would have done, they would have gone out and laid out dumps on the way out to the poles. And then on the way back would have used those dumps to keep resupplying. So they didn't drag all their stuff all the way there and all the way back. We were only going to the South Pole. So we had these supply dumps sitting there. So we'd have to find them. So we knew that if we could get to that resupply dump the next day or that night, we could have the next day off and have a rest day. And that's what we did. And we did our longest stint that day in what the day started gloriously, as I said earlier, but it did cloud over, and we started to get some winds at the end, and it was a final really quite a hard slog. So we deserved our day off, and the next day was Boxing Day, and we had an American on the team. We had Swedish guys on there, Bryony Bailing, who was English. She was the youngest person to go to the South Pole from the coast on that trip. And we had her 21st birthday party on that trip. So we all sat in the tent, and I produced a Christmas pudding. My mum used to make fantastic Christmas pudding. She was still alive then. And I steamed this Christmas pudding in the tent that day in our cooking area. And everybody had, and I took some custard powder, you can get bird's custard powder, and made it with hot water, and everybody experienced, or quite a few of them experienced Christmas pudding for the first time, which was great and very calorific. So perfect for the sort of.
How many were in your team in total then?
We had 7. We started off with 7. Two were guides. We lost one guy within the first week because he got an injury and had to be flown out. And so the rest of them were, people. They're small teams. You don't. We had 3 tents, and we could sleep in 2 if we needed to. We kept 2 people to a tent each time.
And unfortunately for you, it wasn't long in from there where it started to go a bit wrong for you, and you started to go downhill a little bit.
Yeah, I started getting problems with breathing. And at first we were putting it down to maybe altitude, but then we were only going over 9,000 feet, so shouldn't be that much of a problem. And progressively, bit by bit, I was finding it harder and harder to sleep, and it was taking me longer to get going in the morning. And of course, that was quite dangerous because you're dropping behind the team, and you don't want to slow people down because slower they go, the colder they start to get. And it became quite obvious that I'd got some sort of problem. And I was determined to get to our third resupply dump, which was about 540 miles into the trip. And I struggled on and got there. But they'd already had, we'd been going back with a satellite phone and talking to doctors back at the base camp and even back to doctors in the UK, trying to work out what the hell was the problem. And ultimately, I couldn't sleep. The last couple of nights were horrendous. And the last night where we were told to stay there because there was a flight going to the South Pole, and there'd be a doctor on board, they're going to come in and check me out. And I just knew that night that there's no way they'd let me carry on. I wasn't going to make a big argument about it. I wasn't going to fight them over it. I mean, I hadn't had a wink of sleep all night long, so I just packed my gear in the morning. And when the plane came in, the doctors came out to check me over. The funny thing was, there was the flight was actually booked by a bunch of wealthy tourists who were flying to the South Pole, and they landed and all leapt out of the plane and wanted to come over and see real explorers' tents. Want to look inside. Why you want to look inside one of our tents, I do not know. I mean, you can imagine. I wore the same pair of underpants for 54 days, never changed. Yeah. All your kit is wet and soggy from sweat through the day, and you're hanging it up inside. So for us, we got used to it. But for anybody sticking their head in from outside, who just come from a very nice, sort of a base camp, lunch or whatever, would be horrendous. Anyway, they seem to lap it all up and love it. And so I knew I was going, and I was devastated, really. I mean, there's a picture of me looking, basically almost in tears, really, as we're leaving. And one of the reasons, one of the things we thought, we were working on chili time on the expedition. So we assumed it was 8 o'clock in the evening or whatever the time was, 7 o'clock or whatever. And the flight was going from the South Pole back to Union Glacier. But the South Pole works on New Zealand time. So it was actually 8 o'clock in the morning there, and they were on their way to the South Pole. So when I got on the plane, I didn't realise that we then took off and we flew towards the South Pole. So we got to the South Pole, and first of all, I was taken into the big centre there, the American base, to be checked out in the medical centre. And they still couldn't work out what was wrong with me. But these guys had paid for a tour around the South Pole base. And they said, "No, you must come with us." So, and they're very hospitable. They took me, and so I went and had a tour of the South Pole base, which is a huge, great structure, massive, great structure. I mean, if you see it, it jacks up so that the snow can go underneath, because it's the third one they built down there. The other two are now buried in the ice. So this one now, they can jack it up and clear the snow and ice underneath and bulldoze it out. And you can't normally go there if you are on an expedition. They won't very often let you go in because they just don't want everybody piling around the place. Anyway, we got this guided tour. Fascinating. The gymnasiums in there, 300 people worked there, so accommodation blocks, research laboratories, and there was even a greenhouse where they were checking out, and NASA were running that, and checking out how you grow vegetables and plants to if you were going to do a flight to Mars. So you go around and did all that. Quite amazing. And
so in hindsight, like, although you would have wanted to have finished the challenge off, of course you would have done, at least you did manage to say you had got to your end goal in terms of where you were going.
Oh yeah, I stood at the South Pole. I got my pictures by the pole, the different pole signs they have up there, which are sort of permanent features, really. And yeah, I said, I got told off by my wife when I came back, because there's a little shop there you can buy souvenirs. And I said, "Oh, there's a T-shirt I really like." I said, "South Pole achieved." And I said, "No, I didn't buy it because I didn't really achieve it." And she told me off. She said, "Well, you did 540 miles. Some people only get landed maybe 60 miles out and trek in, and they've done a trek to the South Pole," which, again, is still quite an achievement, don't get me wrong, but it's not as long as I did. But so I just thought, well, maybe I'll go back one day, but I haven't got that one on my list at the moment, because things have moved on a bit, and it's not cheap either. So it's one of those things you've got to bear in mind as well.
So when you got back to the UK, then did they decide what was wrong with you when you got back to the UK?
Yeah, I went and had some tests and checks, and I'd always had a heart murmur from a birth defect, and what it was is a leaky valve, and and they decided that the valve had gone, too much. I'd lost over 3 stone in weight as well. I mean, I looked like a skeleton when I got back. I arrived at the airport. My wife was very worried about me. She was monitoring. Took a whole week to get back from when I got evacuated out to actually getting back to London, because it's so complicated with all the admin. And I remember coming off at the airport looking, and she was horrified when she looked at me and thought, oh gosh, she's worried about my weight. And really turned out in the end she was more worried about the ghastly orange cardigan that I'd bought in Punta Arenas before I left to keep me warm. So I just anyway, but when I got home, she suddenly realised how thin I was, and I just looked like a skeleton. So I was really ill, and I'd obviously put a little bit of weight back on in that week. Got checked out, and this valve had given up pretty much, and time was to have it replaced. So I had the old Black and Decker up the front of the chest bone and major heart surgery, and I got it. I got a calf's valve put in. They a lot of people say it's a pig's valve, but apparently my heart was to a certain size. They needed to put a bigger valve in, so I got a calf's valve. I always boast about. So, and anyway, what was amazing after the healing process went through, and I got back in the gym and got out running, I suddenly found myself running a lot faster than I had been running before, and I was running at speeds I'd been running at 10 years earlier, and I thought it was just because I was getting older, and actually the valve had been affecting me on a lot of things I didn't realise about. And then I got invited down to, on my background of skydiving going back many years, did a lot of skydives, and I hadn't been jumping for about 20 years. Pal of mine invited me down to Dubai to do some jumps down there after. So I had the operation in June, and by the following February, March, I was in Dubai, did a couple of jumps in the desert to reacclimatise, and then we did some skydives over the Palm Island, and I got some great shots of me in free falling. And when I went for my first checkup with my surgeon, I showed him one of these pictures, and I said, well, when you've had major heart surgery, it's always worth getting it checked out while it's still under warranty. And
Definitely.
I think I can sign you off.
Sign you off. It's all fine.
Yeah. So great.
Dennis, you are nearly 70. You've achieved a great deal already. Is there anything else left on Dennis Wood's bucket list that you still want to do?
Oh yeah, I mean, there's still a number of things we want to do. I mean, I want to go back and do some more climbing with Richard, my eldest son. He's quite keen to do that, and as you know, I won't preempt what's going to be said on his podcast if you are going to interview him on a podcast. But we get on really well. I mean, both my sons have got really great buddies with, so we go off and do different things together. And Richard's the one who wants to be a bit more adventurous and do something each year. So there are things to do there. My wife and I have still got a delayed trip that we booked up years ago to go down to, like you do, Easter Island, and to Machu Picchu, and to the Galapagos. So we've got all that sort of in the back of our minds as to when we're going to go. Long before I knew about the bucket list company, I'd got deposits down on some of these things. So hopefully we've still got to look at that, and we're going to adjust it. So you may be finding us coming along and talking to you about coming down with you on one of those trips. Well,
it would be amazing to have you on one of those. I mean, I think Easter Island is I did a podcast on it a couple of weeks ago, and it is probably one of my favorite most places to visit. It is just the lifestyle there is amazing. It's not dragging a sled across the ice or climbing up a mountain, but in terms of a destination to go to, it is amazing. Well, Dennis, thank you ever so much for coming on today. It's been lovely to hear the story. Like, you've just kept me. It doesn't feel like I've been recording a podcast. It's felt like we've just been having a conversation about your journeys, and it's been amazing. So thank you ever so much.
Well, thank you, Keith, and I'm pleased I could do it, because I thoroughly enjoyed the time I spent with your guys, and both Gareth and Jake, fantastic guides, and right up there with the people I've worked with in the past who have also been great guides. So it's great to be able to give you a little bit of something back, and hopefully people will enjoy listening to it. Yeah,
thanks ever so much. I mean, to be honest, we're literally, it's not going to be a trip to the South Pole, but we are currently building a trip to Antarctica just because it is on so many people's bucket lists. And it's one of the it's one of the continents that we haven't got anything to at the minute. So, we are really wanting to get there and get that ticked off for people, because it is on a lot of people's bucket lists and it is amazing. And so hopefully within the coming months, we should have that trip available for people to look at as well. So anyway, thank you ever so much for listening to today's episode. I hope you have found it as enjoying as I have, because I've just loved chatting with Dennis. So again, Dennis, thanks ever so much. And I'll speak to you all next week. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Bucket Lister podcast. Be sure to click follow to be alerted for next week's episode. For more travel inspiration, check us out at www.thebucketlistcompany.co.uk or follow us on socials. See you next time.